Resident Evil 2 wastes no time showcasing the changes in priorities in its opening minutes. A shiny new CGI cutscene plays instead of a hokey live-action fare of the original. It's full of quippy characters and musical stings and explosions! Before you can even recover from the heat of the explosions in the cutscenes, you're thrown into the fiery hellscape of a city, with zombies approaching from all angles, and not a single moment to acclimate yourself to the controls. Narratively, this makes for one heck of an exciting incident, but gameplay-wise, it tosses the most difficult section of the entire game at a player who's likely struggling to even recall how tank controls work. Honestly, I probably died 6 or 7 times trying to make it through this intro section, but after this part I died maybe one other time, but I'm getting ahead of myself. On the last episode, I defined survival horror with 3 key factors: limited, obstructed, or abstracted control over your character, meaningful inventory management, and a tenuous balance between being empowered and disempowered. An aspect I felt was inherently present in the meaningful inventory part was that the map design facilitate meaningful choices. Being able to only carry 2 guns in Halo is limited inventory, technically, but it's not really what I'm talking about when the map is mostly a straight line and you can pick up more weapons off the bodies you create. To that end, it's worth noting that something like a Metroidvania maze, or at least something not completely linear, would probably be necessary as a part of survival horror, with keys and locks and all that jazz to make inventory more meaningful. And if I'm being this detailed, I guess I should also add spooky atmosphere as a sort of requirement, but that's really subjective, so it's a little harder to quantify in an essay. It's only in seeing what this game keeps the same and what it tweaks from the original that I realize I need to perhaps define these aspects a little more clearly. And on that note, let's look at what Capcom did change from Resident Evil 1. As mentioned at the start, the differences are made clear almost immediately. This game isn't interested in building up a slow, creeping terror by giving you just enough tools to barely scrape by. Instead manages to build risk and reward terror by keeping your inventory space limited and asking you how many times do you want to backtrack through this hall. While this seems inherently less tense to me, it still provides enough decision-making and agency to allow a cocky player to be scared. This change in particular allows you to treat Resi 2 as either a slow but safe crawl or a frantic flight, unlike 1 which almost demands a more cautious pace to it. Given the shorter length of the campaigns, the abundance of action set pieces, the reduction of meaningful key item choices, and the zapping system, which we will discuss later, it seems clear the creators were hoping players would lean more towards that second, more action-focused option. While it's more streamlined, the first game structure is still largely intact. Once you get past that bombastic intro, the first area, the police station, largely mimics the mansion with a first and second area. Both games then transition into 3 largely linear sections, though Resident Evil 2 does seem to allow for a bit more wandering and kind of dead ends than the first game. Despite all these tweaks, the game manages to keep that balance of power fairly similar to the first game, though I suppose the bell curve is a little less flat, with both your powerlessness at the start and your overwhelming strength at the end both doubled respectively. And that curve is smaller than the first game as well. Despite requiring 4 run-throughs to see it all, those individual campaigns do feel rather stretched thin, and I was already starting to grow tired of the repeating content by about halfway through my second run. The pacing throughout the entire game felt very jittery compared to the slow buildup of tension from the first game, and all in all, the events felt very jumbled or cobbled together. It's not that Resi 2 is a bad game at all. It just seems like a lot of the strengths from the first game, which are great pacing, replayability, kinship with point-and-click puzzles, were traded for more flash-in-the-pan action and an emphasis on presentation. This game feels like someone took the slow-paced survival horror game that was Resident Evil 1 and attempted to wrench it into an action shooter title, which, if you know anything about the development history, is almost exactly what happened. Resident Evil can definitely work in action scenarios. Some of the best titles in the series are more action-focused. However, taking this cramped style of controls born of point-and-click RPGs and trying to make bombastic gunfights out of it might have been pushing the gameplay systems just a little bit beyond their practical strengths. After long stretches of running and gunning rather mindlessly, it feels jarring to be suddenly stopped and forced to do block-pushing puzzles. And the original game, with its tight pacing and thoughtful approach to enemy placement and combat that were just as much a puzzle as the rest of the mansion, those brain teasers felt right in line with the rest of the game. In 2, however, you'll be running and gunning when suddenly it's like, and now for something completely different. I feel so far I've been rather harsh on this game, especially in comparison to its prequel. It feels odd, given my ranking of the entire series, I placed this one just barely under Resi 1. I actually enjoy both games quite a decent amount. It's just the context of this game that I feel leads to harsher critiques. Resident Evil 1 was inventing a whole new genre, so it was sure to be so rough around the edges that you might lose a finger trying to get a handle on it. But it's a lot easier to forgive those flaws when you see just how good the good of it really is. I suppose it's just difficult to see those good qualities ignored, rather than emphasized or expanded on in the sequel. Thankfully, it's not all sour grapes here. I've probably been overly critical, partially because this game is often considered the best of the classic series, and I don't think it's really fully earned that title. But there still is a reason plenty of people adore this game. As I mentioned before, the presentation has been lifted to a whole new level. The variety of creative monsters has also been increased noticeably. In the original game, you mostly had zombies, human-animal hybrids, and just large animals in general. 2 introduces much more horrific and creative mutations in the form of G-virus creatures, and while combat complexity is definitely less interesting on the item management side of things, actual encounters can often involve a little more thought in the movement, with positioning often being something you're required to take more seriously than before. All the same, it feels like an odd choice for a game where combat is more of an excuse to force ammo management, to then make the moment-to-moment fight such a priority, while downplaying the puzzles so much. Resident Evil 2 feels like it punishes exploration, since so often areas seem like they should be accessible, but are locked away solely because you're in the wrong route, from A or B, or you're the wrong character in the right route. It leads to each run feeling rather incomplete and unsatisfying, while still requiring tons of replays if you want to see it all. Unfortunately, there just isn't much to see. If you do take time to go off the beaten path, all you'll find is an overflowing surplus of ammo to add to your already comedic supply of bullets. There's rarely any meaningful story snippets or insights into other characters off the beaten path. There's no moment like the guardhouse diary from 1, or the interesting unveiling of the inner workings of Umbrella. Any tidbits you do find about the plot are all on the main story path, which, as I said before, you must repeat 4 times to fully understand. The best example I can think of in how 2 disincentivizes exploration is the Fingerprint Scanner. Near the end of the game, you're forced to do a decent amount of backtracking off the beaten path to find this optional login to a hidden computer that you can then use to enable a 3rd tour where you can scan in your fingerprint. After doing this with both characters in the A and B route, you can finally enter a super secret room containing yet more ammo for a gun you likely won't even be carrying at this point since you're so overburdened with ammo, and an empty tube with nothing in it, and no hints as to what, if any, story significance it might contain. This could have been such a cool hint towards the next game's nemesis, but nope, it really is just more ammo and an empty tube. What a waste. And look, I know the N64 game let her retcon some discount hunter model that showed up an outbreak in the tube, but I mean, talk about too little too late. This rather sad event is part of the much-touted zapping system, which really amounts to like one other time when you get to pick who gets the unnecessary extra gun and who gets more item spaces to decrease backtracking, and then a few places where for some reason you decide to ignore the enemies, they show up again in Route B, but you'll be drowning in ammo, so this will never happen unless you are intentionally trying to avoid killing enemies. I love the idea in concept, but it goes so underutilized that it strikes me as more of a neat piece of trivia than the back-of-the-box feature it's so often touted as. So while I wish it were more fleshed out, it does really detract from the game, fingerprint example aside, and it does give replays a small sense of experimentation. On the topic of underutilized though, let's talk about Mr. X. If you know one thing about the remake of the game, it's Mr. X, but in the original, he's a character who shows up maybe 5 times between both B scenarios and can easily be run past in all cases. There's never a meaningful reason to fight him. Unlike his successor and Nemesis, Mr. X doesn't drop meaningful rewards that give you a reason to stay and fight. Unironically, aside from cutscenes and his final boss appearance, I probably spent longer talking about him than he actually appeared on screen in a normal playthrough. He's a great idea, but in execution, Mr. X is such a non-entity, there's not really much more to say about him. I need to clarify again. Resident Evil 2 isn't a bad game. If just feels like a game that doesn't know exactly what it wants to be. Or rather, it's a game that feels it knows exactly what it wants to be, only it wants to be two mutually exclusive things at once. You can almost feel the back and forth tug between slow-paced, thoughtful survival horror and twitch action horror, pulling this game apart at the seams, and it just barely holds together. But it does hold together. Especially in a modern market, where classic survival horror is all but forgotten, this game is definitely worth your time. I just don't think it holds up quite as well as the game before it, and I feel while it's probably worth going through an A/B scenario, if you feel like me, it's probably not worth going through the 6 times I did to make sure you get the appeal. By the time I had everything memorized, it actually made for a pretty fun little speedrunning game, but a game that takes 5 playthroughs to hit its stride might be one that's not worth sticking with that long to hit that level of enjoyment, at least if you think like me. It feels weird to have been so negative on a game that I ranked so close in quality to the first game, and that I spent a whole video ago praising. It's probably just context that's caused me to feel this way. This was supposed to be the holy grail of classic survival horror, the best-selling of the old-school Resi games, the sequel to a game with so much promise that it blew my mind. So for it to come out kinda like the first, but not really as thought-provoking or well-paced, hurt me a bit more than I want to admit. I know some will feel I should take this game on its own merits, but by nature it's a sequel. There's a reason it's called Resident Evil 2 after all. I guess in the end it just speaks to the quality and legacy of the series, that when one of the games is just okay, I'm disappointed. Because to me, Resident Evil almost always means top-notch quality. I'm Dalin Malna. God bless.